design and health and technology. And she's got a really interdisciplinary practice that looks at developing different wearable technologies, emotional technologies, which she's going to talk through today a little bit more about the process as well as some of the work that she's been doing. So if you'd like to join me in welcoming Leah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I just thought it's really funny. I was just thinking, I might use my keynote presenter notes, but I can't see them, so I'll just make it up. It's fine. I actually know what I was going to say. So thank you to SensiLab for hosting me today and for coming along and for sharing the work that I've been doing. So my research and practice is really focused on designing wearable health technologies, spaces and experiences to improve or save life. And that's kind of a fairly broad framing, but it makes it very easy for me to decide what direction my project should go, because I think I guess there's a natural inclination towards healthcare projects. So I work a lot with experts from across different sectors, from electronics, medical sciences, nanotechnology, healthcare, but through to fashion design and weaving, and increasingly in marketing, commercialization, and IP, because that crunchy end of product design is where I need to learn more. In terms of the projects that I've been doing over the past sort of 10 or so years, I've been developing jewellery to administer insulin through the skin for diabetics. And this was probably the first example of when I started to work with an embedded design process. And so when I think about kind of embeddings, I've done 3 embeddings, which is living for a long period of time in a scientific or engineering scenario, and developing projects, but also trying to kind of affect cultural change over time. And so the first one that I did was with Nanotechnology Victoria, 2007 to 2008. And I was embedded there for about a year and a half, had a baby halfway through, so it was kind of an interesting elongated design process. And they were working with about 40 different nanotechnologies at the time. And I was very attracted to their healthcare technologies. And they developed this extraordinary patch, which is 10 millimeters across and 2 millimeters thick, and it has about between 1 and 10,000 microneedles on its surface, and enables insulin to be transmitted, or nanostructured insulin, to go through the dermis into the bloodstream. And some of you might have heard the story, but the thing that I found really interesting when I was there is that they had this very elegant solution, which was really tiny and beautiful and clear, and then they'd got some really great engineers to design a drug delivery device. And the drug delivery device was a big blue rocket launcher with a red button, and it came in a metal suitcase. And so people had to trade their little tiny syringe for this suitcase. And I was like, I don't think that people are going to want to trade, even though they feel stigmatized. I'm a bit embarrassed about the syringe. It's small and it's portable, and I don't think they're going to want to swap that for a suitcase. And so if we can empathize with them and be in their shoes for a period of time, having coffee with a friend, I'm just going to take my metal suitcase to the bathroom. You're just not going to do it. So is there a way that we can make it smaller and more elegant and more delicate? And so, we ended up working towards this, which is actually a drug delivery device. It works, sort of had to work however many times over and over and over again, but it also looked like a piece of jewellery. And that applied the patch to the skin, and the ring holds it in place once it's there. So unfortunately with this project, Nanotechnology Victoria, after 7 years, lost its funding, and all of the IP went back to the universities. And IP in universities, it's a nice place for them to live. IP lives in universities nicely, but they have a hard time getting out of universities again. And so it was just this sort of sucked in absorption, and the project was never commercialised, which is a bit of a shame. But it has its own life, travelling the world and generating ideas. While I was at Nanovic, I also was working with a really interesting powder, and this is nanostructured mesoporous iron oxide, which can remove arsenic from drinking water. So in places where arsenic is prevalent in well water, there's large tracts of Southeast Asia. And I was talking about this to some students this morning, and I think one of the things that was interesting is at the time there were lots of arsenic removal plants that were being set up, water purification plants set up in various disadvantaged countries, and they were being set up but never maintained. So after a year or so they would start to degrade and fall apart. Whereas this was a really interesting solution. It's a powder, and at the nanoscale, particles of mesoporous iron oxide are attracted to the arsenic. And so it was really about a storage vessel, necklace, jewellery, something that sits on the belt. But working with this It looks so big, but it's actually quite small. So basically a little water carrier that had a whole series of filtration devices. And you would just, get some well water, put a bit of the mesoporous iron oxide in, and it didn't matter how much, about a teaspoon's fine, let it sit for 20 minutes, give it a shake, and then strain it out and you could drink your water. So thinking about, particularly with this, it sits quite nicely against the space of the body. It's kind of curved on the inside, a little bit convex on the inside and convex on the outside. So I started to work quite closely with the spaces of the body. I'm just going to whiz through because we don't have much time, and we can talk about it all again. In this sort of space of swallowables, which is a really hard space to... oh, hello, nice. Hello. It's like a reunion here. We caught up in Hong Kong last time. So swallowable devices. I was looking at sort of the idea of whether you could less painfully and when you have to detect particles of gas in the digestive tract, you either have to get this sort of long thing that goes down that way or goes up this way. It's a very awkward and uncomfortable situation. Even though you might be anaesthetised during the process and what's going on, the lead up to it can be very, very stressful. So we were thinking about a way that you could design a small seed, basically looks like a fish oil tablet, that unravelled in the digestive tract like a flower and moved through the power of peristalsis. And peristalsis is this very clever process that the digestive tract has to move things along. So this is an example of a speculative project, but some master's students have taken it on and they've developed the technology and now they're commercialising it. But unfortunately in the process, design has fallen by the wayside. The thing that's being commercialised, I was like, no one's going to want to swallow that. Look at the size of that font, like it looks enormous. But they didn't take that comment. I work a lot with hearing technologies, and so about 4 years ago, I started working with Blamey Saunders Hears, and they're a Melbourne-based hearing aid company, and they're very creative, and they have very much a telehealth model. And so this was the first thing I did for them, which was a little seed or a little pot in your pocket and helps you control the experience of your hearing aid. So you could upload sort of up to 8 or 10 different programs, one for bike riding, one for church, if you're that way inclined, one for noisy cafes. So it was really personalising the experience of your hearing aid without having to do this. And it's sort of the interconnecting thing between your phone and your hearing aid, now that I've designed a hearing aid. And eventually it will be got rid of, but it's like this in-between technology. This was inspired by the borlotti beans that are in your cupboard. And so it gives you a bit of a sense. I do a lot of drawing inspiration from the natural world to inform the creation of things. Emergency jewellery. This is just a quick fly-through. Emergency jewellery to communicate identity in allergy in times of medical crisis, and which uses micro-projection devices to beam your information on the wall of the ambulance or on the road or wherever you might be. The funny story about this one is that we were trying to do it in a really high-tech way, and then I went to the post office and I found a little mini mouse watch that actually had a tiny little projector in it, and it's really microfiche technology. So we went, we can hack that, and we can actually use technology from 25 or 30 years ago to do this in a much faster way than what we were looking at. Microprojectors. It just got too complex. From time onwards, from 2007 onwards, I've also been playing a lot with advanced materials and textiles. And so I've experimented with these are electricity conducting textiles. I've worked with much mess with magnetic liquids and exhibited works at MoMA. Not MoMA, sorry, I wish. GOMA. There I am, getting ahead of myself. GOMA and other places. So the way that we work with nano-engineered materials is really interesting because you can't prototype with balsa wood and then make the work with nano-structured something. This is magnetic liquid. You need to prototype with magnetic liquid. The only way to understand the material properties. So I think of it as this kind of material empathy. You need to engage with the material itself to understand what its properties are and to see what it affords and where it wants to go. Worked a lot with electroluminescent materials, which are great because they have a nano-structured electrode in them, so they never get hot. So you can install them for like 3 years, they never get hot. And my children wrap themselves in them, and they don't seem to be damaged. Shape memory metals. So this was a small jewellery piece that unravelled in response to the temperature of the skin. Yeah, and also I'm very interested in shape memory polymers, which can change shape in 2 directions. But yeah, there are complexities, and that's what we were looking at with the seed sensor, whether you could use shape memory polymers, so something that could open, deploy, and then close up again prior to ejection from the body. The other side of my practice, and I'll go into detail with a few of my more contemporary projects, is about developing co-design methodologies and to tackle big problems. And I've got this toolkit, which is called the Tactile Toolkit, that we've used with about 170 people to address really complex and sticky problems. And so we've used it with the Victorian Healthcare Association to understand the obstacles to implementing voluntary assisted dying. Last week we used it with the Primary Healthcare Network to understand the obstacles facing disabled men in the western suburbs. And we're about to use it in Newcastle to understand the experience of people with acquired brain injury in nursing homes. So we don't shy away from complex things, but it's very much about engaging with the emotional experience of people at the centre of the process, whatever that might be, and defining goals for that person, and then starting to understand what the roadblocks to goals might be. And Rowan's been a guinea pig in one of our workshops, which was looking at end-of-life experience. We've just made a nice documentary about it, so I'll send that around. And you end up with these really interesting diagrams, which this was about someone called Wanda wanting a good death. You know, she was in the process of trying to access voluntary assisted dying, and the diagram then tells you what are all the roadblocks and the workarounds. The workarounds are the purple circles. The stakeholders that need to be brought in at different times to her achieving her goal, which was a comfortable, she was in control. I just thought I'd show that because I usually choose to do one or the other, and I thought it's sort of interesting for you to see both sides of that practice, and that it's not always an object-oriented practice. You can take a lot of the prototyping approaches to breaking down big problems. So the thing that kind of really drives the wearable side of the practice is how can we create wearable health technologies that resonate with people on an emotional level, but that also function medically and technically. And I have thought about this quite extensively, and I finished my PhD last year, and I came up with sort of 4 ways that we could do this, or that I can do this within my practice. so it did quite well last year. It got lots of recognition, which is nice. So which has been really good for me because I'm going to CSIRO this Friday to present, and I can say, you gave me the Design Innovation Award, can I come and live with you for a year? And then we'll see how that goes. We're sort of talking about the next embedded residency there. So going wide, I'm just going to flip forward, is about this idea of looking outside the frame to inspire the development of technologies or services or spaces, to destigmatise them. And in order to do that, I've spent a lot of time in the archives at the Melbourne Museum with the head of sciences and the other geologists there to get inspiration for form, texture, colour, connection mechanisms, all sorts of things. And over the course of designing this project, so I was embedded for 37 weeks in the company, which is really unusual too. So often designers brought in for 6 weeks at the beginning, and you hand over all your files to a mechanical engineer, and all sorts of things, all sorts of decisions get made, and you're not at the table anymore. And those decisions can have really interesting impacts on the human experience at the end of the technology. And so what my mandate is can I be at the table every single week and ask the annoying questions continually and continue to annoy you until we end up with something that people actually want to wear. So this process of spending time in the archives was wonderful, and that's why I've got the big picture of the macro crystal, on the SensiLab invite, is that I just really enjoyed the process of seeking inspiration for form, but also the way that they deal with information was extraordinary and so fabulous for the way that I could structure my thinking. So how do you archive design process? And if you make 200 models, the 200 physical models, but about 1,200 digital models, what do you do with them and how do you archive them? And what better place to get inspiration than archivists, because they're madly good at this stuff. And so I was spending a lot of time going, so what do you do and how do you do that? And how do you archive things like genus and species? But the outcome really, and Rowan will know this, the challenge as any kind of product, even an accidental product designer like myself, is that you've got one mould and you need to make things look different enough so that they're viable for different markets. And so this is the black SUV of the hearing aid market. It's quite matte, and it's sort of directed towards the man in the boardroom who is losing his hearing but doesn't want to lose any sense of power. And so he's like, it's black, and it's like my car behind my ear, and it's small. People still think I've got it, it's all together, it's fine. This shiny pearly white was, something quite different. I'm going to keep an eye on my time, but it was really interesting being at the table with the engineers, and they said, you can have any colour you want, but you can't have gloss. And I said, you can't have gloss? Like, if you can't have gloss, how are you going to make something precious? Like, if you can't have gloss, and they were like, what are you talking about? And I was like, really important they have gloss. And so it ended up being this huge process, a totally different process, very expensive, possibly, but, a complex route to getting this really glossy, lustrous outcome. And I've got a bit of footage from a user of it, and you'll see it. The rose gold fits really nicely with all sorts of skin tones, and is actually my favourite, quite pretty. And the silver sort of fits into the hairline of people with white or silvery hair.
Initially, I actually thought they were so beautiful. I chose the white glossy colour, and I just think it's really pretty. So initially I thought, obviously the functionality of it is amazing, but I also thought you can have the functionality plus the beautiful earpiece as well to match as an accessory with your jewellery.
So that might not seem groundbreaking, but the idea that I'm matching this to my jewellery as opposed to I'm 23 and I have hearing loss and I feel really embarrassed that I have to wear a hearing aid and it's disabled beige and it makes me look about 87. This is a huge shift, and it's this idea of can you go wide so that you can help these technologies to shift categories, to shift from medical devices that we put in the cabinet to precious sentimental things that we put, on the bedside table with our rings and jewellery. So this sort of idea is to kind of intrigue users so that we can lower the barriers to entry, particularly for young people who are experiencing hearing loss, and anyone that's experiencing hearing loss. And the reason that I want to do this is that I spend a lot of time reading papers about what happens to your brain when you have hearing loss and you don't treat it. and the brain starts to rewire itself. And we all know about brain plasticity, but if you don't have the inputs going in, then the auditory cortex can start to be annexed by the visual cortex, so your vision might get better, possibly, but you start to lose, the brain starts to lose the capacity to hear. People tend to delay by about 10 years, and by the time they start to use a hearing aid, the brain can't hear the way that it used to, and so your experience of hearing will be different and degraded. And so when I see people and they're like, oh yeah, I can't really hear, but I don't really want to hear, it's really embarrassing. I'm like, well, your brain. Sorry, but I've got something to show you and it's really nice and maybe you could give it a try. So the outcome is this little pod, and yeah. So moving on, the second thing is this sort of idea of collaboration, and how do we just collaborate in a much more seamless way and get rid of all of the drama about collaboration, because we have to collaborate to make great things happen in this space. So this is the Smartheart, and this is a project. So the previous one is a project that's commercialised in the market, and this is a project that was 18 months long, funded by philanthropic, and didn't go to commercialisation, but still has a whole lot of learning in it, and that was for different reasons. So this project, it's called the Smartheart, and it's a necklace to replace the cardiac Holter monitor for people who've had heart attacks or arrhythmia. It seeks to replace this thing here. Yeah, I don't think that it really needs replacing, but sorry, I'm joking. Yeah, big, chunky, 1980s pager around your neck for 24 to 48 hours, sticky electrodes all over the body. And when I was speaking to the cardiac technicians at St Vincent's Hospital, who were collaborators, I said, oh, how do you get a really good trace? And they said, oh, we use this sandpaper. We sand the skin. And I was like, isn't it a little difficult for elderly people that have thinning skin? And they were like, no, but we get a really good signal. We get a great signal. Excellent. And I was like, okay. And then I spent a whole lot of time in aged care, and people were talking about, I can't get them off. Like, it takes me 8 to 10 days to get them off without tearing skin. And they just, it's pretty rough. So we were looking at whether you could take all of that stuff and embed it into something like this. And so what this is the computer is the big jewel, the battery supply on both sides, all of the wiring is in the neck piece there, in the band. There's sensors at the back of the neck, and that was the biggest technical challenge. How do you sense ECG, like a full PQRST wave at the back of the neck? And it's challenging, but you can do it. So we worked for a year and a half in advanced textiles and also with an engineering group, and trying to get them to work together to make this. And the idea was to shift from 24 to 48 hours to long wear devices. So you wear them for 10 to 12 hours a day, you just put them on. I put on my watch every day. And then you take them off at night and they just inductively charge next to the bed. This is a really great collaboration between design, so this is me doing my little sketching thing, and weaving and engineering. And being in a team of weavers was really quite extraordinary. It's a really special and wonderful skill. And in order to get the weavers and the engineers to communicate with each other, I had to develop these diagrams, and you saw one of them just a minute ago. Because weavers have specific weaving diagrams, and engineers have specific engineering diagrams, and neither of them speak the other one's language. But I was this sort of designer in the middle, as designer as translator. And I was like, how are we going to get you guys to talk to you guys? And so I ended up settling on the one-to-one scale architectural plan. And so we would use these plans, or I'd make these plans, and the weavers would say, oh, from that I can derive picks per inch and warp length and number of things on the warp, and what kind of warp fibers we're using, and they would measure off it, and you saw the weaver there kind of measuring off the one-to-one scale plan. And the engineers could work out sensor locations, the number of wires we had to have coming and going. And so they were really handy. So that's just a bit of fiddly-diddling. Yes, so the outcome, and you see the sensors are based in the back of this, but the outcome was something interesting from a physical point of view, but the collaboration methodologies were really interesting. And I guess coming to every single process and every project and saying, what are the mechanisms through which this team can cohese and can work together? And is it a drawing modality? Is it an event? Is it an experience? What do we need to do to make these people understand each other? And as a designer, I'm sort of adept at learning enough of little bits of languages. So I know enough of nanotech, I know enough about biomedical sensing, I know enough about a few things, not as much about some things as other people do, but enough to be able to start those conversations and to identify and to look at the problem often from the other person's perspective. The engineers will see the shortfalls here, how can I help convince them? Come to this side. So the third thing that's really critical in the practice, I'm going to do another 5 minutes, I think. Is that okay? Yeah, all right. Is the idea of inviting people into the design process. I might whip through this. And as I said, I spent a lot of time in aged care, all sorts of situations, but trying to understand the experience that people have with their wearable health technologies and also with their jewellery and treasured possessions. And, starting to think about, can this lady here, can we combine those things? Because she said to me, I'd wear a falls monitor, because the falls monitors look terrible. I'd wear a falls monitor if you could make it like my earring. And my engineer was like, we can do that. That's a big earring. It's fine. We can do it. But what I found when I was doing these engagements over the years is the women would talk about their loved and cherished possessions, like their jewellery, in this really really warm and wonderful way. Like this woman saying, I'm very honoured to be able to wear my grandmother's gold bracelet, which was presented to her on her wedding day. So it's about 150 years old. And the other type of terminology, or the way of talking when they were talking about these hideous falls monitors was, it's a bit big and bulky, but it's handy if you need it. The nurse told me I had to wear it. There's this whole sort of compliance aspect. And the nurses in the back room would say, oh, they're terrible. And sometimes actually they create more problems than solutions, because if people fall on them and they have thinning skin, they can get abrasions and adverse outcomes. Biscuits. So in terms of doing these engagements, I think a lot about the multisensory aspect, and you now own Sarah Pink, and you know about her work, so she's amazing. But thinking about how do we create engagements so that people can bring their whole selves to the table. And that means the smell of the coffee and the good quality biscuits. What is it that brings these people to the table so that they feel calm and happy enough to be able to tell me not just about, at 7 a.m. I put on my device, and at 7:15 I take it off, but I felt a little bit embarrassed today because it was like this, and then someone looked at me, and when I was 15 my hearing started to go. Whatever those stories might be that help you actually design something that's a bit better. This is just me and some of my ladies. So coming to the final idea is this idea of kind of prototyping continually in order to get better design outcomes. The prototypes play a really significant role in these engagements, and they're about getting people to engage with things and test technologies in pockets and on bodies, and to give you that feedback. So prototyping. So there's some of the Smartheart prototypes. So for that I spent a lot of time with the geologists as well, actually. So I'm just going to round up with this idea of prototyping continually, often regularly, and the idea that one prototype doesn't really mean anything. Like the whole project is about iteration and continually evolving something until it's as close to the perfect outcome as it can be. So we made about over 200 iterative models for the Facet hearing aid, and these are some of the models here. And we all do lots of 3D printing, but I really like testing out different printers, so the titanium printers and the stainless steel printers and polymer printers, and there's a whole lot of form change that happens along the top. And every time we would 3D print something every single week, and then test it with the audiologist. Then they would give us audiological feedback, and test it with the signal processing engineer, and test it with the mechanical engineers, and then test it with people. And then we'd get all of this feedback and iterate and change, and then reprint for the following week. So the models are a thing, they're an object, an artifact, but I also think of them as small wins. And so small wins are about this idea that you bring something into the world that enables us to cluster around, like we're around a little campfire, and helps us to get beyond and just move to the next stage. So any single huge problem can be broken down into tiny little pieces. Yeah, and each of these models is an example of one of these small wins. And we slowly and incrementally work towards something. And they have this really wonderful ability to get rid of people's concerns, because you've brought something out and you've said, okay, let's stop fighting. What do you think about this? and people are like, oh, well, I think we should do this, or we should do this. And then, you know, somehow the conversation becomes constructive. And this just sort of shows a little of the 3D models and the different types of ways of working around the model. So multidisciplinary teams, engineers, audiologists, industrial designers. She's our chief audiologist and signal processing engineer. And this guy is called a KEMA. Has anyone worked with a KEMA? KEMA is like a audiological mannequin that you can put, it's got a hollow head and replaceable pinnae, so you can take its ears off, and you can have large man ears, small lady ears. They're quite extraordinary, and you can put microphones inside its body so that it hears the world as you would hear. So it's quite an interesting technology. Yeah, and I just sort of like this idea that I'm not just an artifact, but I actually shift alignments and create trust and create relationships. And this is just some of the within the workshops. I would have prototypes, you know, particularly with the hearing aid users, and they're sort of handing things from person to person, created this great sense of intimacy and trust in the group. Okay, yeah, and I guess the end point is sort of this idea that I'd like to create wearable health technologies, but also experiences and spaces and services that people want to engage with, is secondary, and their therapeutic functionality. This sort of idea of kind of living better lives with greater ease. And I just like this little next snippet because it sort of explains how the technology works, but also is a very kind of personal reflection on the technology.
What I want to say is I love my little pod, and I take it with me everywhere I travel. And you know, people, for some reason, one of the most appealing things is I hate changing batteries. I hate the expense of them. And in this new thing, I just pull it off like that, take one out of there, pop it back in like that, and a little Australian voice says hello, and I'm back on deck. And I'm so impressed with the whole design and the fact how simple and pleasurable it is to use, and it's actually improved my life. And for people who've had more severe hearing loss than I've had, I'm sure that would make a radical difference to their lives. So thank you very much.
Yes, so thank you very much for listening. So, do you have any questions or comments or discussion? Suggestions that we do?
When you're saying that you're embedded in, say, a business or at the archives, what does that actually involve? Like, are you there every day? Are you there once a week? Are you there for an hour? Are you there for, 8 hours? Yeah,
no, good question. I wasn't embedded in the museum. I just visited a lot. Yes, and so I've done 3 embeddings, and so Nanovic was a couple of days a week over the space of a year. I was in an advanced textiles lab for 18 months, and that was 2 days a week pretty much. Blamey Saunders, I was 2 days a week. I was talking to Cyro about 1 day a week, kind of like a visiting scientist. But I think I've thought about it for a while, and I think what it does great things for my practice, and a lot of what I'm interested in and the university is interested in me doing is about this kind of translation. Like, how do you get great tech or innovation that's on the bench and translate it into things that not necessarily go to market, but ideas that people can engage with. So I'm really interested in that. But what happens within scientific organisations over time is that if you've got that little kind of furry thorn in the side that's asking those difficult questions over time, then people start to ask those questions. Yeah. And so particularly with my nanotechnology colleagues, they'd say, I've just never thought about that. Like, why are you asking these questions? Because I'm looking at a nano scale, I'm looking, they can't even see it. They're like, the scanning electron microscope tells me that this nano-engineered molecule is getting close to this one. But you have a designer in there and they're saying, so what can that do for, what good is that? What does that do? Can we use it in this? And we put it there, or we put it here, and what happens if we do this? And is it dangerous? And it just gets people thinking in a really different way. Yeah. But there's no rule. It's just more bringing design in earlier, or artists and designers in earlier, and just long-term engagement. And when I count up my hours, like I just did my tags, and I was like, that doesn't cost that much really, when you think about some of the other costs in designing a product, but it's something that people don't think about. that long-term immersion in design thinking. I think it's really extraordinary. Yes.
Thanks, Leah. It's a great talk. With all the physical prototypes, you're talking about archiving when you went to the museum and looking at how archivists do it. Do you actually archive your physical prototypes in a way? Instead of just photographing them, do you actually put them in displays? I noticed that some of your photographs had them all lined up like that.
Yeah. So the museum owns a lot of them now. Mm-hmm. So they acquired 150 of the iterative models into the heritage collection. And that was a really wonderful experience for me to see what they did with them. Like, how do real archivists deal with this work? So they displayed them for 2 months or 4 months. And that was, so that again, it's a slightly different point, but that was really extraordinary because that meant that the public, 100,000 people came and saw design process isn't fast. Medical technologies don't happen. I had a great idea and I made it and it went to market and it failed or succeeded, and Rowan and I have this chat sometimes that we've got all this great work, but so much of it can be tucked into people's IP and stuck in organisations. But the archiving side of things, so I have my own methodologies and they're a bit messier than real archivists. But I create these huge, I don't know what they're called, they're kind of tree structure diagrams that record every single prototype. So I can show you one afterwards. But I have different ways. So I archive, when I'm embedded, I have a week by week Scrivener folder. So I archive all of the experiences and drawings week by week. And then there's 4 different things. And then I put everything into these tree diagrams to make sure that I understand spatially and temporally when I made things. And then every single prototype gets put into a little tiny plastic bag with a label on it because they all look alike and they look like small brown teeth. I have got no idea, like they change by 0.5 of a millimetre. So if you don't label them straight away, and this was early on, I hadn't put annotations in the models, so I was like, this and this look very similar. So yeah, I just got really friendly with my Dymo labeler and just label everything. Yeah, so I have these sort of multiple processes. They're just kind of self-generated. Yeah.
Actually, a related question then. So say an exhibit of 150 prototypes, is that a serendipitous outcome of that process, or is that something you also build into your process to kind of ensure that not only do you get an amazing hearing aid out of it, but that you get these other ways to get people to engage with the work?
I think I'd already been doing it, like I'd been doing it, but in a really messy way. So with the Smartheart, I made, probably 100 prototypes, but I didn't label them and I didn't manage them. I didn't file manage them well enough. And then I just have no idea what's what. And then I'm starting to look at them and go, is that derived from this crystalline form or that? No, I've got no idea. So this, when I had the 37-week stint, I knew from the very beginning that I have to be very careful about this. And so, and I knew that that's how I like to work. And I think I did learn over time that if you can bring something physical into the world, it really helps these interdisciplinary teams to gel. And there's other techniques that I use them for too, which are more political probably. So in an organisation, every organisation has power structure, and I'm trying to get the input from the people not just at the top, but from at the bottom, in the middle, and halfway out. And so I started to set up these exhibitions in the audiology company, or in the hearing aid company, and I'd set up little exhibitions, and I'd send out, I'd get my colleague to send out a thing to all the staff, and so people could come at lunchtime and give some feedback, and that was a really nice way for people to engage, but you needed the physical artefacts to do that. And it's a nice way to make sure that the decision making isn't just coming sort of top down, but sort of in from all sides. So it's serendipitous and planned, and I'm just getting better at it. Yeah, but I think a lot about how you archive design process, because it's easier when it's a physical thing, but how do you archive thinking over time? And that's why, I don't know, Scrivener is my sloppy way of doing that, but I just think every week something's happened and I need to record that. But now that I've finished the PhD, I'm getting lazy again.
Leah, is the Smartheart an actual product now that people can use?
No, it's
So does the success of Facet mean that you can go back and activate the success of another project?
Possibly. Yeah, I think what it does is, I gave a talk about IP last week, IP and commercialization, and that was a good example of, there's two different things. So Facet was, I started designing in September of 2015, and it was launched in March of 2018, and Laurel and I have both had really similar parallel experiences. You were in Cochlear, I was doing this hearing aid, and really close research alignment. Had no idea about each other or each other's work because you're not allowed to show anything. And so Smartheart was the opposite. I was like, I've got this beautiful set of a beautiful set of images, and the lure of beautiful images is that you want to publish them. I'll put them in a book, and I'll put them, in a paper, and then had a conversation with the IP people, and they were like, well, it's kind of out there, and also it was a very crowded space. And we went actually to make change. You're going to need $1 million, and we just didn't have. It was a really small thing.
It's potentially a dumb question, but is the gender specificity of the necklace actually limit?
Yeah, it comes up all the time. So it's like, I think that project is just, it just went with a kind of female thing, because I was working mainly with women in aged care. But I didn't mention it, but we're working on a little sensor to detect loneliness. And so that one, it's like a lapel pin. And the way that we're customizing it to different people is to take impressions of loved and cherished possessions. And so for a man, it might actually look like a lion's pin, or it might look like a medal that I got in Vietnam. And so I actually want to wear it. So trying to get away from that gender specificity, but in a way that's not so bespoke that it's impossible to scale. Yeah, good questions though. Yeah, the coming back is interesting, because now I'd like to go back into diabetes work, and I just see how revolutionary that technology was so long ago. That was 2007. That little tiny patch, and it's still not. It could have been out in the market. Crazy, and it was a working technology. It was like Monash University and Melbourne, and they were all involved in it. And then it just I think it was before universities were really getting better at commercializing. Yeah. Yeah.
Are they now?
No, but
there's a relative to it. It's like
God.
Slightly.
No, I don't know that they're better or they're not worse, and at least they're talking about it, and they're hiring some quite smart people, so at least there's people you can talk to about things. But they do still sit on technologies. Yeah. Does anyone have any comments or feedback? Always doesn't have to be a question. I don't like the way that you did that. No? All right. Well, I hope it was useful.
Yeah. Would everyone like to join me in thanking you?
Have you commercialized your